Live from WTTW 11. This is Chicago Tonight. Here's Bob Surratt.
Welcome. On Chicago Tonight, the rising price of gasoline. Rick Samuels looked for some alternatives today. He'll be here to tell us what he found and what was missing. Despite fierce competition, State Senator Barack Obama won the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate by a landslide last month. Tonight, he'll talk politics with Elizabeth Brackett. Now to Elizabeth Brackett and her guest. Elizabeth?
Bob, in the primary race for the U.S. Senate, State Senator Barack Obama faced opponents with political name recognition, some of whom had seemingly bottomless campaign funds. But he still won the Democratic nomination by a landslide. Now he faces Republican candidate Jack Ryan in November's general election. Here to discuss his views on hot campaign issues like the economy and the war in Iraq is State Senator Barack Obama. Welcome,
Great
Mr.
to
Obama.
see you, Liz. How are you?
Very good.
Good.
Very good. You know, we just saw this piece on high gas prices. And apparently Senator Durbin and Congressman Chakowski said that the president ought to talk to OPEC and see if they can expand supply. Is that a good idea, and do you have any better one?
Well, I think it's a critical idea. Part of what we have to look at is how gas is priced, and obviously OPEC has an enormous influence on it. This is an example where I think having a proactive foreign policy that takes into account our current dependence on foreign oil, hopefully weans us off it, but also recognizes that if Saudi Arabia and other key OPEC members are supposed to be our allies, then the last thing they're going to be doing is jacking up prices precisely at the time when we're trying to get out of what's been termed a jobless recovery. That kind of leverage is something that we should be able to exert, and I'm surprised that the president hasn't already done so.
But how much should the U.S. government actually intervene to do something about gas prices? I mean, do you want the U.S. government going to oil companies?
Well, I think what we have to look at is contrasting policies. You've got the president on the one hand who insists that our energy policy should be based primarily on drilling in Alaska, expanding capacity, and subsidizing oil companies. That's been his strategy. I would prefer a strategy that thinks about how we're going to increase fuel efficiency standards for cars and how we're going to work with our allies overseas to ensure that oil companies and gas companies stay profitable, but that they're not taking advantage of American consumers. And I think those two things in combination would serve us better than the kinds of approaches that the president has taken.
You're talking somewhat about foreign policy. In Iraq over the weekend, 13 Americans were killed. There was a Shiite uprising in Baghdad. There were 1,200 U.S. troops going into Fallujah to try to secure it. Now, you've made your opposition to the war clear, but what does the U.S. do now?
Well, first of all, it's just heartbreaking, the scenes that we've been seeing over the last week, and my heart goes out to the families of the brave men and women who've been fighting over there. It is true that I was a strong opponent of the war, but I also feel that now we've got to make sure we get the job done. I think that the Bush administration generally has been slow in executing not the war. I thought the war went exactly as planned, but the peace is something that has eroded.
But right now, since there's anything but peace,
Right.
What does the U.S. do? Should more troops be brought in?
Well, I'm not a military expert, and so I think that it's important that we talk to the people who are on the ground to get a sense of what is required to make sure that our troops are secure. Over the long term, what we have to do is we have to continue to internationalize this process, and we have not done a good job of doing that. Part of the problem is that the Bush administration has an extraordinarily grudging view towards the participation of other countries. Their attitude is you can come in on our terms, in the same way that you can come in and help rebuild and help finance rebuilding as long as Halliburton and Bechtel are getting no bid contracts for that process. So it's critical that we get other countries involved, but to do so, we're going to have a different tone and a different approach towards our multilateral relationship, something that the Bush administration has had trouble doing.
But right now, the U.S. is the one that's there.
Absolutely.
I mean, you've said you thought troops should be withdrawn.
No, I've never said I've never said that troops should be withdrawn. What I've said is that we've got to make sure that we secure and execute the rebuilding and reconstruction process effectively and properly. And I don't think we should have an artificial deadline when to do that. I think what's important is that we have a long-term planning process and a short-term security strategy.
But there is a deadline now. There's the June 30th deadline when the U.S. should trying to turn the government over to to Iraq.
Well, that's a political deadline, but that's not a military deadline. And what's important is what I don't want is a situation in which we have 80 or 90,000 young American men and women who are over there in a situation where they do not have the resources sufficient to ensure their own protection. And what we have to do is make sure that we have enough troop strength. As long as we have troops there, we have to make sure that we have enough troop strength to make sure that we are safe and secure. But the long-term process has to involve getting the UN involved, getting multinational organizations involved in the reconstruction process and the political process. And frankly, it's going to be a difficult task. It's not something that's going to be easy. It's part of the reason that I was concerned about us going in there in the first place.
Now, Senator Lugar said over the weekend that that deadline perhaps should be extended. The president said today, absolutely not. The June 30th deadline should not be extended. What do you think?
Well, I think that having made this deadline a focal point, I think it's going to be hard for the Bush administration to go back on it because I think it would cause additional strains and tensions within Iraq. What I think we have to make sure of, though, is that this deadline in terms of governance does not necessarily mean that we are automatically going to be scaling down our troop strength or our military capabilities until we have security and safety, not only for our troops, but also for the Iraqi people.
But just finally, I mean, over the weekend, Iraq has looked pretty ungovernable. If Shiites are rebelling, if they're not going to be a part of this governing coalition, this particular group of Shiites, but they have their own militias, 10,000 people in this al-Badr's militia.
Right.
So what do you do immediately in order to ensure that a June 30th deadline is even possible?
Well, listen, this is a big, difficult, messy situation, and I think it's important for us on a bipartisan basis to figure out how do we execute a transition to power to the Iraqi people at the same time as we're making sure that our troops are secure and we've got an exit strategy over the long term.
Do you think the U.S. has an exit strategy?
Right now, I don't think we do. And I think that the only way that we avoid an open-ended commitment that is going to cost us more in terms of lives and billions of dollars is to make sure that we have other countries in the United Nations involved in that process. And that requires the United States government ceding not military authority, but significant not only political authority, but also commercial authority over the process.
The other hotspot, of course, is the Middle East. Now, Ariel Sharon has now said that he does not stand by his pledge any longer, that he would not harm Yasser Arafat. He's also said there probably won't be a Palestinian state for years. So what does the U.S. do at this point? Do we continue to support Israel with those kind of policies?
Well, I think our support of Israel is unequivocal, and I think it needs to remain in place. What I think we have to do in order to move off the status quo is we've got to figure out how do we incentivize and encourage a set of moderate Arab leaders who recognize that violence is not going to be an appropriate strategy for us, for them to bring about the kinds of outcomes that they want ultimately.
Do you have an idea of how to do that?
Well, I think that those folks are there. I have confidence that there are Palestinians, and I've met them, who want nothing more than to be able to get a decent paying job, send their children to school, succeed economically, and have peace. The problem is that you've got factions within the Palestinian community that are also vying for power with each other, as well as having different ideologies with respect to Israel. And I think that what we got to do is strengthen those persons who may be pressing political claims, but recognize that violence is not the appropriate way to do it. And when we are able to identify those people and bolster them and encourage them, then hopefully we have the kind of partners for peace that we need.
And if Yasser Arafat, if Sharon holds true and say Yasser Arafat is killed, does the U.S. continue to support this policy?
Well, I think that we have to wait and see the direction in which Israel's going to be moving in. What I'm absolutely clear about is that the Israeli people, I think, want a change from the status quo. They are suffering from the situation and have no interest in maintaining the kinds of conflict that's existed. I think they will respond politically to the extent that they feel that they've got a partner for peace on the other side.
Let's get to some more U.S. issues.
Right.
Now, the economy, of course, is a huge issue, and creating jobs has been something that you've campaigned hard on. Last Friday, jobs reports came out, and 30,000 new jobs were created, more than in the last 4 years.
Right.
3,000 in the last month.
Right.
Also, the stock market has been going up. I mean, perhaps the economy isn't as bad as the Democrats' dire predictions are
Well,
saying it is.
Well, I think
So how do you campaign on that?
There are two ways of looking at that statistic. One is to say that certainly the economy improved this month in terms of job creation. Although what's also important to note is that included 70,000 jobs that were counted by grocery store workers in California going back to work. The scenario may be being painted a little more rosy than actually exists. But let's assume that in fact we're making progress in terms of the job front. The other way of looking at that statistic is what you just said, which is more jobs have been created this month than over the last several years. What that tells me is that we've got a structural problem in this country. On the way over here, I was listening to a new report that showed that wages, that the share of productivity gains that are captured by workers has stayed flat, even as corporate profits have risen to record levels. What you've got is middle class and working class Americans who are being squeezed. They're working longer hours for less pay. It's harder for them to find jobs that pay a living wage. And it's those structural long-term issues that I think the Democrats are going to be debating on, because that points to whether or not my children, your children, your grandchildren are going to be able to have the same standard of living as we had when we were coming up.
You know, the Republicans, what they have said about you and Jack Ryan's campaign is that you are just way too liberal. Tom Roser said that you are the most liberal candidate for the U.S. Senate that has ever run in Illinois.
Somebody called me left of Mao Zedong. So that gives you some sense of the Republican rhetoric. Look, take a look at my 7-year track record. Right, I worked with Republicans on every single major initiative that I had. I'm the only candidate in this race who's ever cut taxes, setting up the earned income tax credit that gave $100 million in tax cuts to people who really need them. What really we're debating here is a Republican administration, an increasingly Republican Party, that says if you don't embrace a radical economic agenda that is only about tax cuts to the wealthy, then somehow you're on the left.
Are you saying that you claim the title of liberal? Label of liberal?
I do not
proudly or not?
I do not claim those labels because I think that the debate has shifted so far to the right that somebody like a Jack Ryan, who calls himself a conservative and yet embraces a Bush plan that has put us $500 billion in the red annually, and then wants to compound it with additional tax cuts to the wealthy that would end up exacerbating the problems we already have, that's not conservative. To me, that's radical. And I think that if you look at my track record, when the people of Illinois look at my track record, what they'll realize is that I have been concerned with the things that working families in Illinois are concerned about. Tax cuts for people who really need them, job creation strategies, a rise in the minimum wage, making sure that health care is accessible and affordable to children who didn't have health care, making sure that we reform a death penalty system that everybody acknowledges was broken. Those are all issues that are mainstream, common sense issues, and I think it's a sign of Republican desperation that they're trying to throw these labels because they have no substance behind it.
Now, the one place you didn't do that well was in Southern Illinois. You came in third among the Democrats in Southern Illinois.
Although it was very close. I mean, we got 25% of the vote.
Oh, you were still third.
But that was also based on the fact that we were only up on television for about a week compared to folks who had been down there.
The point is on the issues that many in Southern Illinois care about, particularly gun control,
right,
and abortion.
Right.
Some of the more issues that people have called you a liberal on.
Right.
How are you going to relate to the people in Southern Illinois, the one area where you didn't do as well as you did in the rest of the state?
Look, there's no doubt that there are cultural differences between Northern Illinois and Southern Illinois. What is also true is that what ties us together is more important than what pushes us apart. When you go down and travel through Southern Illinois, what people are concerned about is how am I going to get a job that pays? How am I going to make sure I don't go bankrupt when I get sick? And how can I make sure that my children are getting the kind of education that allows them to compete in the global economy? And I think that the Democrats have better ideas on each of those issues than the Republicans do.
All right,
and that's what's going to motivate people to go to the polls.
The rest of the campaign.